The millionaire had invited the black cleaning lady as part of a cruel prank. She showed up with the grace of a star, leaving everyone stunned when they learned her true identity. Laughter echoed through the grand hall of the Blackwood estate in Beverly Hills as Victoria Sterling descended the elegant staircase in a gown worth more than what most of the guests made in a year. But the laughter wasn't kind. It was harsh, mocking, and filled with spite. "Well, look who decided to grace us," Richard Blackwood muttered to his companions, raising his flute of Dom Perignon. "Our dear maid." At 35, Victoria never imagined she'd enter that ballroom as an invitee, even under false pretenses. For 2 years, she had scrubbed every corner of that mansion, always unnoticed, always quiet, observing the elite pretend civility while ignoring her like part of the decor. The invitation had come 3 days earlier, handed to her with a smirk she knew too well. "Charity gala, this Saturday," Richard had said, slipping her the gold-trimmed card. "Black tie, of course. I'm sure you've got something elegant at home, right?" His friend's laughter bounced off the walls. It was clearly a setup, meant to ridicule her before California's elite. Richard had even invited tabloid reporters to capture what he considered a life lesson. "Wanna bet?" Richard told his wife Helena the day before as Victoria vacuumed nearby. $100,000 says she won't show? And if she does, she'll be tonight's circus act." Helena chuckled wickedly. "You're awful, Richard. She'll probably come in something borrowed and be gone in 15 minutes, too ashamed to stay." But Richard Blackwood didn't know 2 key truths about Victoria Temps. First, she'd grown up in places like that long before she ever had to scrub their floors. And second, some storms don't break you, they teach you how to dance through them. As she crossed the ballroom under jeering eyes, Victoria held her head high and her gaze steady, like someone carrying truths that could shatter that world. Her steps were poised, intentional, as if every motion had been rehearsed 1,000 times. "Oh my God, she actually came," whispered Patricia Weston, a senator's wife, to her companion. "And look at that dress. Where did she get it? Probably rented. She'll be paying it off for months," sneered Vivian Chambers, daughter of an oil tycoon, masking her own insecurity with venom. Pathetic. What they didn't realize was that Victoria hadn't borrowed or rented the gown. She had simply retrieved it from a chapter of her past. A past that Richard would have erased if he'd known it existed. Richard strolled up, puffed up with self-importance, flanked by his ultra-wealthy friends. He was sure this moment would prove his control and status. "Victoria, what a delightful surprise. I knew you wouldn't miss it." After all, when someone like you receives an invitation to something like this, someone like me? Victoria echoed, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Please, Richard. Finish your thought." For a brief instant, her tone made him falter. There was a certainty in it that didn't match the meek woman he remembered dusting his halls. But his ego quickly returned. "You know, someone who isn't usually part of this scene. Must be overwhelming with all the class and luxury." Victoria's smile was subtle and unreadable, not nervous, but composed, almost dangerous. A few guests instinctively stopped chuckling. "Overwhelmed?" she repeated quietly, her eyes locking with his, forcing him to inch back without realizing. "Not at all, Richard. I feel exactly where I've always belonged." The hush that followed only lasted seconds, but it was enough to shift the entire energy of the evening. Something in the way Victoria carried herself, the way she held the room, made it impossible for anyone to see her as just a maid again. Richard cleared his throat, trying to reassert himself. "Well, I do hope you find the evening enjoyable. I imagine it will be quite enlightening for someone like you." "Oh, I have no doubt it'll be enlightening for everyone here," Victoria replied, her eyes slowly scanning the group, as if memorizing each guest's face for later. If this tale of justice and unexpected turns has you hooked, stay tuned. Because what those wealthy elites didn't realize was that Victoria held a truth so powerful it would turn their night of ridicule into a painful lesson in prejudice and judgment the entire Beverly Hills circle wouldn't forget. Richard found himself enjoying the situation more than anticipated. Victoria hadn't fled in shame like he expected. Instead, she stood there, unnervingly poised, a confidence in her stance that was beginning to make him uneasy, though he didn't understand why. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard called out, tapping a spoon against his glass to draw attention. "I'd like to introduce our guest of honor tonight, Victoria, our faithful housekeeper." The room erupted in malicious laughter. Flashbulbs flickered as socialites snapped pictures, eager to post with mocking captions online. "Richard," Helena whispered beside him, feigning concern. "Don't you think this is a bit much? Cruel?" Richard chuckled loudly. "I'm doing her a favor. When else would someone like her set foot at a function like this?" Victoria stood in the center of the room, unmoving, every eye fixed on her. But instead of the shame they had hoped for, her face reflected a calm that unsettled the room, the composure of someone who had endured far more than public scorn. Patricia Weston approached with her entourage, wearing smug smiles. "Victoria, darling, how long did it take you to pick out that dress? Must have been quite the struggle finding something appropriate." "Actually," Victoria replied, her voice so steady it made Patricia waver, "this dress has a story. It was my mother's." "Her mother?" Vivian Chambers snorted. "And where would her mother find a dress like that? A luxury consignment shop?" Victoria smiled again, but this time the smile carried something sharper. "My mother wore this dress the last time she walked into a ballroom like this. That was 2 decades ago, back when she was still known as Victoria Temps Blackwood." The room fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence, people suddenly aware something significant had just been said. Richard, who had been chuckling with his circle, turned to face her, slowly. "What did you just say?" "Temps Blackwood," Victoria repeated, her tones slicing through the quiet like glass. It's interesting how some people choose to forget parts of their family history when it suits them. Richard's skin lost color. Helena instinctively grabbed his arm, sensing danger in the air. "You're insane," Richard muttered, though his voice didn't carry its usual conviction. "I don't know what stunt you think you're pulling. This isn't a stunt, Richard," Victoria said, stepping toward him as several guests instinctively stepped back. "It's truth. Our truth. The truth you buried when it was easier to erase certain names from the family record." Phones continued to film, but now the tone had changed. The crowd murmured, whispers growing louder and spreading like sparks. Helena tugged on Richard's sleeve. "What is she talking about?" "She's lying," Richard insisted, though his trembling hands betrayed him. "Just some unhinged employee looking for attention." Victoria reached into her handbag and pulled out something that drew audible gasps. A ring, not just any ring, but the Blackwood family engagement ring, complete with the signature crest and a deep blue sapphire passed down through generations. "This," Victoria said, raising it high, "was given to my mother by her father, Henry Blackwood. My grandfather. The man you told your children died without heirs." Richard looked like he'd been punched. "Where did you get that? How dare you steal?" Victoria laughed, the sound devoid of amusement. "You can't steal what's already yours by birthright, Richard." Patricia Weston, still staring, leaned in and whispered to a friend. "Do you think she's telling the truth?" "No way," Vivian answered, though her voice had lost its certainty. "Richard would have mentioned having a cousin." Victoria turned toward them, catching the remark. "Cousin? No, darling. I'm not Richard's cousin." She paused deliberately, locking eyes with Richard. "I'm his half-sister." The room erupted into gasps and hushed whispers. Richard looked stunned, like he'd been struck. "That's absurd," he barked, though his voice trembled. "My father would never. This is a lie. Henry Blackwood was in a relationship with my mother, Isabella, for 5 years," Victoria continued without wavering. "She was the family's piano tutor. When she became pregnant with me, your father promised to support us, and he did, right up until the day he died." Helena stood frozen, one hand over her mouth, looking between the two like witnessing a disaster unfold. "You," Victoria said, pointing directly at Richard, "made the decision to erase us. You stopped the financial support, sold the home your father bought for my mother, and abandoned us to struggle in poverty." "I was never obligated to," Richard began, but Victoria cut in. You didn't think you had a duty to care for your father's daughter? Fascinating point of view, especially considering you inherited every cent of a legacy that should have been shared. The weight of her words was settling over the crowd like a dense fog. Many guests were now subtly distancing themselves from Richard, as if afraid to be associated with the scandal. Then prove it, Richard demanded, panic creeping into his tone. Anyone can spin a tale and flash a ring. Victoria's expression shifted into something fierce. Oh, Richard. Do you truly believe I came here tonight without receipts? She held up her phone, gesturing toward the entrance. You can let them in now. Every attempt Richard had made to shame her had only fueled a deeper fire inside Victoria, one that had been quietly building for years. What these people didn't realize was that every insult, every dismissal had become part of a long, carefully prepared reckoning. And Victoria had spent 2 decades learning exactly how to claim what was hers. More than money, it was justice. At that moment, 3 people entered the hall who would alter the course of the evening, and many lives. First came Diane Morrison, one of Beverly Hills' most renowned investigative reporters. Next was David Chun, an attorney known for high-profile inheritance disputes. But the third person made Richard physically recoil. Dr. Hamilton? Helena gasped, recognizing the longtime family physician. What are you doing here? Dr. Hamilton, who had cared for Henry Blackwood in his final years, stepped into the center of the room. His hands trembled, but his voice did not. 20 years ago, I was coerced into signing a false death certificate. Henry Blackwood didn't die of natural causes. He was slowly poisoned with arsenic over several months. The crowd reacted with shock and horror. Diane Morrison lifted a hand. Please refrain from filming. This is an official statement being documented for legal proceedings. Richard looked panicked, drenched in sweat. You've lost your mind, Hamilton. My father died of heart failure. No, Hamilton replied firmly. Your father discovered you were siphoning company funds. He had changed his will to include Victoria and intended to contact authorities. Not long after that, he began experiencing alarming symptoms. Victoria stood in silence, her eyes welling up with tears of vindication. After 2 decades, someone was finally revealing the truth. David Chun removed a document from his case. This lab report comes from an independent facility. A blood sample tested last week confirmed lethal arsenic levels. Lies! Richard yelled, completely unraveling. This is a setup to destroy me. Diane stepped forward. Mr. Blackwood, I have transcripts of 5 recorded conversations between you and Dr. Hamilton from 2003 and 2004, during which you threatened to ruin him professionally. Victoria then stepped forward, her voice slicing through the noise like a blade. Richard, you didn't just take our father's life. You robbed me of 20 years. I didn't kill anyone. Richard shouted, spinning around, accusing everyone. You're all lying. Then explain this, Victoria said calmly, connecting her phone to the estate's sound system. A recording began to play. Richard's voice echoed through the hall. Hamilton, you're going to stay quiet about anything odd in the old man's blood. If you talk, I'll make sure you never work again. And as for that woman and her brat, they're on their own. The silence that followed was crushing. Even Richard's former allies were now backing away from him. Helena stared at her husband, devastated. Richard, did you really do this? For 20 years? Victoria let out a cry, her control slipping for a moment. 20 years of scrubbing my own father's blood off the hands of the man who took his life. She inhaled deeply and recovered her unnerving calm. You want to know how I gathered all this proof? I didn't end up working here by coincidence. I aimed for this job deliberately. I spent 2 full years preparing, earning access to this house, gathering everything I needed. Richard made a final, desperate attempt. Even if any of this is true, it won't change a thing. The inheritance was dealt with years ago. David Chun allowed himself a slight smile. Actually, Mr. Blackwood, in cases where murder is proven, all assets can legally be reassigned based on the original will. And we're in possession of Henry Blackwood's true will. Victoria moved closer to Richard, who now leaned helplessly against the wall like a trapped animal. Do you know what my biggest error was, Richard? Thinking you might change on your own. Please, Richard whispered, all pride gone. Think about Helena, the kids, this will destroy us. No, Victoria said. You destroyed the family the day you chose greed over what was right. Richard sank into a nearby armchair, utterly defeated. In under 2 hours he had transformed from a powerful tycoon to a publicly exposed criminal. Victoria looked at him one last time. He was shattered, but this was only the beginning. What Richard hadn't yet understood, and would soon discover in the most painful way possible, was that Victoria had spent years gathering not just proof about their father's death, but also a mountain of evidence exposing Richard's decades of financial crimes, coercion, and corruption. Her plan was precise, and his downfall would be absolute. The following 2 hours turned what was meant to be Beverly Hills' most elite gala into the most sensational scandal California's high society had ever witnessed in real time. Richard now sat slumped on the ballroom floor, his back to the wall, watching his entire life unravel before his eyes. Diane Morrison had connected her laptop to the estate's projector. Documents, photographs, and recordings began flashing across the large screen for everyone to see. This is a transfer of $200,000 from Richard Blackwood's personal bank account to Dr. Hamilton, dated 3 days after Henry Blackwood's death, Diane narrated as the image came into view. The note on the transaction says, "Silence is golden." Helena now stood on the opposite side of the room, as far from her husband as possible, silently weeping as she processed 2 decades of deceit. And here, Diane continued, is a recording of Richard instructing his accountant on how to hide stolen company funds. Richard's voice played loud and clear. I need you to cook the numbers. If anyone finds out I siphoned off $20 million over 5 years, I'm finished. Blame it on the market, growth expenses, anything. Patricia Weston whispered, stunned. He stole from his own business. In the center of the room, Victoria remained still and composed, the calm center of the storm, watching each revelation dismantle the life of the man who had robbed her of everything. David Chun stepped forward with another folder. Mr. Blackwood, beyond the criminal charges, I'm informing you that Miss Thames is filing a civil suit against you for $50 million, for wrongful death and inheritance theft. $50 million? Richard murmured, eyes unfocused. I don't have $50 million. No, Victoria answered softly. But your company's valued at $120 million, and half of it has always been mine by birthright. Diane Morrison resumed her damning slideshow. We've also confirmed Richard engaged in blackmail against at least 5 local officials, paid off 3 judges, and redirected charity donations into personal accounts. Each new revelation brought fresh gasps from the crowd. People who had once proudly called Richard a friend were now backing away like he was toxic. Victoria, Richard said weakly. Please. You've won. End it. Victoria stepped closer and crouched down in front of him, her eyes meeting his. You murdered our father. You took away my family, my inheritance, my dignity. You made me wipe his blood from your hands for 2 years. I can fix this, he begged, his voice barely audible. You can't fix 20 years of betrayal, she replied with chilling clarity. But there are consequences. Helena's phone rang. It was one of their children, calling from college. Mom, are you okay? They're saying online that Dad's a murderer. Helena looked at Richard with total revulsion. Even your own children are learning who you really are, from social media. Richard tried to rise, but his legs buckled. Helena, please. The kids? No, Helena screamed, cutting through the noise and freezing the entire room. Don't you dare mention our children. You've marked them with shame for life. Dr. Hamilton walked up to Victoria. Miss Temps, I need to let you know I've already contacted the authorities. Richard will be arrested later today for murder. Victoria nodded. Murder, fraud, blackmail, tax evasion, he'll spend the rest of his life behind bars. She turned to face the crowd, who looked at her with a mix of awe and fear. Let me make one thing clear. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, for everyone crushed by men like Richard Blackwood. Patricia Weston approached hesitantly. Victoria, we're deeply sorry. We didn't know. You knew I was treated like garbage, Victoria replied coldly. You laughed. You played along. The only thing that's changed is now you realize I have more wealth than you do. The distant wail of sirens began to echo. The police were arriving. Richard gave Victoria one final look. You've ruined my life. No, Victoria said, rising with quiet strength. You ruined your life the moment you chose cruelty. I only made sure the truth was seen. As the officers came in and placed Richard under arrest, Victoria stepped onto the balcony. Outside, a crowd of reporters, photographers, and news crews waited. The story had already gone public. Helena joined her on the balcony. Victoria, I truly had no idea. I know, Victoria replied softly. You were one of his victims too. What happens now? Helena asked. Victoria gazed out over the shimmering city. Now, Helena, justice will finally be done, and maybe Beverly Hills will learn that class has nothing to do with wealth. As Richard was escorted out in handcuffs, down the same hallway where he had tried to shame her just hours earlier, Victoria experienced something she hadn't felt in 2 decades: peace. What Richard didn't yet realize, but soon would in his prison cell, was that Victoria had orchestrated every step not only of his collapse but of her own rebirth. And now, the Blackwood Empire had a new heir, one who would use its power to protect the very people Richard had spent his life crushing. 6 months later, Victoria Temps Blackwood sat in what had once been Richard's office, now completely redesigned. The walls that once showcased symbols of vanity now held certificates from community programs and framed photos of workers promoted from the bottom ranks to leadership roles. Richard had been sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. The list of convictions included murder, embezzlement, coercion, and tax crimes. All his personal assets were seized to compensate the victims. Victoria had been just one of many he'd wronged. Miss Temps Blackwood, said Amanda, her new executive assistant, who used to clean the offices, Forbes is here for the interview about the company's transformation. Victoria smiled. In half a year, she had grown company profits by 40%, simply by treating her staff with decency. Fair pay, merit-based promotions, and a respectful atmosphere had created levels of efficiency Richard never achieved with his toxic rule. Helena had divorced him immediately and moved to another state with their children. Before leaving, she met with Victoria to apologize face to face. You had every reason to destroy us completely, but you protected my kids. I'll never forget that. Children shouldn't be punished for their parents' sins, Victoria told her. They deserve the chance to be better. Dr. Hamilton now worked as a company medical advisor, offering free healthcare to all staff. I never thought I'd find the courage to do what's right, he admitted during a meeting. But you showed me it's never too late to reclaim your integrity. Patricia Weston and Vivian Chambers tried to reconnect with Victoria in the weeks after the scandal, but she kept them at arm's length. You mocked me when you thought I was beneath you. Now that you know my net worth, you want my friendship. That tells me everything I need to know. Victoria's story spread across the world. She was invited to speak at major universities about ethical leadership and justice, but she preferred to focus on real change. I don't want fame from pain, she said during a rare interview. I want to be remembered for what I built afterward. The company now funded scholarships for employees' children, ran a microloan program for small businesses in struggling neighborhoods, and had founded the largest domestic violence support initiative in California. On a calm afternoon, Victoria received a letter from prison. It was from Richard. Victoria, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to understand that you made me see the monster I became. Every day I tried to comprehend how I turned into someone who could murder his own father, and almost his mother, for money. During their last visit, my children asked about you. They want to meet the aunt who protected them when their father failed. Victoria kept the letter, choosing not to respond. Forgiveness was a personal path, but justice had already been fulfilled. During her Forbes interview, the journalist asked, "Some believe your actions were too harsh. How do you respond? Victoria answered with composure. Revenge would have meant doing to him what he did to me. Justice is making sure he answers for his crimes and that others don't suffer like I did. The difference between the two is crucial. And what advice would you offer to others facing injustice? Victoria glanced outside, watching employees enjoy their lunch in the company garden that now gave them dignity and respect. The greatest revenge isn't destruction, it's creating something so powerful that the wrongs done to you become just the beginning of your success. That evening, Victoria returned not to the modest apartment where she had once fueled her fight for justice, but to a warm home where she had adopted 2 orphaned girls who, like her, needed a second chance. As she helped them with their homework, her thoughts turned to the father she never truly knew, but whose legacy lived within her. Henry Blackwood would be proud to see that his daughter not only reclaimed what was stolen from her but transformed a company built on exploitation into a beacon of hope and fairness. Victoria's real achievement wasn't bringing Richard down. It was showing that when power is rooted in justice rather than fear, it expands and uplifts everyone it touches. Richard had tried to degrade a cleaning woman and ended up learning the hard way that he had misjudged her entirely. But more importantly, he realized that dignity can't be bought, passed down, or taken. It's earned through the quiet choices we make when no one is watching. If this story of justice moved you, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove good always triumphs when you use the right strategy, and that sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone overlooked.